At 2:17 a.m., a smartwatch recorded a murder. That's what the prosecution said. That's what 12 jurors believed. That's what sent Melissa Harper to a corrections facility in Goodyear, Arizona, where she has spent the last 3 years maintaining, with the same flat and infuriating calm that convicted her, that she did not kill her husband. The watch said otherwise. Or at least, that's what everyone agreed it said. Nobody looked carefully enough at what it actually recorded. Daniel and Melissa Harper had been married 9 years when the data started telling a story neither of them wanted told. From the outside, the marriage looked fine. Better than fine. They lived in a clean, well-landscaped house on Ridgemont Drive outside Scottsdale, the kind of neighborhood where people wave from driveways and organize block parties and silently compete over Christmas lights. Daniel was 41, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who remembered your name and made you feel briefly important for it. He coached Little League in the spring. He had opinions about craft beer and grill temperatures, which in their suburb was essentially a complete personality. Melissa was 38. She'd left a marketing career 3 years earlier to raise their son Caleb, and she'd attacked motherhood with the focused intensity of someone who needed to be excellent at something. The house was immaculate. The lunches were handmade. The yard looked like a magazine spread. Nobody on Ridgemont Drive worried about the Harpers. That was the problem. The dangerous marriages are never the loud ones. The loud ones announce themselves. Voices through thin walls, a car door slamming at 2 a.m., the particular silence of a house holding its breath. You can see those coming. You can prepare. The quiet ones are different. The quiet ones build pressure invisibly, one small resentment layered over another, until something gives, and everyone who knew them stands at the edge of a crime scene, saying they never saw it coming. Melissa noticed things early. She noticed when Daniel started showering at night instead of in the morning. She noticed when his phone screen started landing face down on the counter. She noticed when he came home smelling not like another woman, but like outside air, like he'd walked around the block twice to clear something from his system before walking through the door. She didn't confront him. Not yet. Melissa Harper was not the kind of person who walked into a conversation without evidence. Years of watching Daniel deflect and minimize had taught her that accusation without proof was just noise, and noise gave him permission to dismiss her. So she waited. She watched. And then she did something that would eventually be used to destroy her. She looked at the data. They'd set up a shared family health dashboard 2 years earlier. Daniel's idea, ironically, part of a brief mutual obsession with sleep tracking and step counts and the general project of optimizing themselves. Melissa still had access to his smartwatch sync. He'd never thought to change it. She opened the app on a quiet Tuesday night after Caleb was asleep, not expecting much. She scrolled through weeks of Daniel's sleep metrics. Resting heart rates, movement logs, the boring numerical landscape of a man's ordinary nights. And then she saw it. February 14th, Valentine's Day, 2:17 a.m. His resting heart rate had been 58. Then, in the span of 60 seconds, it jumped to 143. The graph looked like a mountain rising from the ocean floor. It lasted 4 minutes, then dropped, then slowly flattened back into sleep. She stared at it. Then she checked the previous night. Flat. Normal. The night after. Normal. She went back 6 weeks and found 7 instances, all between 2 and 2:30 in the morning. All with the watch connected to their home Wi-Fi. He was inside the house each time, his body doing something his sleeping wife knew nothing about. She started wearing her own smartwatch to bed. Comparison data. On every night that Daniel spiked, her own readings stayed at 54 to 62 beats per minute. The deep, slow rhythm of real sleep. She was sleeping. He wasn't. She began watching the guest house. It was a small, detached studio at the back of the property. They called it a guest house, though actual guests had used it twice. Mostly it held storage and a Peloton and a bathroom nobody cleaned often enough. But it had its own entrance from the back fence line, and the fence line connected to a pedestrian easement that wound behind several properties on the street. The third night she watched, the light came on at 2:14 a.m. She stood at the dark kitchen window and watched the glow through the studio glass, and she understood. Not as suspicion anymore, as fact. Her name was Carrie Solis. She lived 2 houses down. 36, recently divorced from a marriage the neighbors described with careful vagueness as difficult. Dark-haired, comfortable in herself in the way that can feel magnetic to someone who isn't comfortable at all. Daniel had given her a key to the back gate and to the guest house. He admitted everything on a Tuesday evening in late February. Melissa had waited until Caleb was asleep, sat at the kitchen table, and placed her phone face up between them with the heart rate graph already loaded on the screen. She didn't accuse. She just showed him the numbers and said, "Tell me what this is." He looked at the graph for a long time. Then he told her about Carrie. 4 months, mostly physical. The words came out pre-packaged, edges sanded down. Melissa listened without interrupting, which seemed to unsettle him more than screaming would have. When he finished, she asked one question. "How many times at 2:17? He looked at the phone. He didn't answer. She said, "End it." She stood up and went to bed. For 12 days, the spikes stopped. 12 nights of flat, normal data. Daniel in bed at a reasonable hour, sleeping through to morning, his heart rate doing what sleeping men's hearts do. Melissa watched the graphs each morning with the careful attention of someone reading test results, and she allowed herself, not hope exactly, but the possibility of something survivable. She had seen marriages come back from worse. She was willing to try. Then March 3rd arrived, 2:21 a.m. 156 beats per minute, higher than any previous reading. She lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and felt something settle inside her. Not grief, not anger, something colder. The particular clarity that arrives when you stop being surprised and start being certain. In the morning she said nothing. She smiled at Caleb over breakfast. She drove him to school. She came home and she searched. She searched. Cardiac events during sleep. She searched. Oxygen levels and heart rate spikes. She searched. Hypoxic episodes and wearable detection. And on one afternoon that the prosecution would return to 11 separate times during trial, she searched. Oxygen deprivation timeline and unconsciousness. She would explain, on the stand, that she'd developed a medical theory, that the spikes weren't an affair resuming but a physiological event. Sleep apnea, cardiac arrhythmia, some oxygen-related issue that the watch was detecting. She'd wanted to understand the data before she accused him again. She'd been humiliated once by confronting him without proof. She wasn't going to do it again. The jury didn't believe her. Maybe they were right not to. Or maybe they were looking at a list of searches without the architecture of anxiety that produced them. A woman alone in a kitchen, certain her husband was lying, reaching for any explanation that made the world make sense. The searches looked sinister in a courtroom. In real time, at 10 in the morning with a cup of coffee going cold, they might have just been a frightened woman trying to understand something she couldn't stop watching. Both can be true. A search history can be innocent and look guilty. A mind can go to dark places and never act on them. The distance between a dark thought and a criminal act is sometimes the most important distance in the world. But distance is hard to show a jury. March 7th was a Saturday. Caleb was at the Garcias for a sleepover. Planned 2 weeks earlier, the prosecution would note, as though scheduling your 6-year-old's social calendar was evidence of premeditation. Melissa said she'd been in bed by 11:30, read until just before midnight, asleep by 12:15. Her own watch confirmed it. Resting heart rate consistent with deep sleep from 12:30 onward. Daniel's data told a different story. 2:16 a.m., 132 BPM, already elevated, already not sleep. 2:17, 151, 2:18, 163. Then 2 violent acceleration bursts from the movement sensor, not 1, 2. The kind of readings that, when projected on a 12-foot screen in a Maricopa County courtroom, made several jurors flinch visibly. They looked like thrashing, like a body in distress, like the last recorded movements of a man who was losing a fight. Then flatline. 2:19 a.m. Melissa called 911 at 3:04. 41 minutes later. That gap was the prosecution's home. They lived there. They returned to it in opening statements, in closing arguments, in every examination of every witness who could plausibly speak to it. 41 minutes. Why would a wife who woke to find her husband collapsed wait 41 minutes to call for help? Shock, said the defense. Dissociation. The paralysis that real trauma produces, which looks from the outside nothing like the theatrical grief people expect. Coordination, said the prosecution. Covering tracks, making sure the story was right before the first responders arrived. The 911 recording was played for the jury. Melissa's voice was flat, controlled. She stated her address. She described finding Daniel unresponsive. She answered the dispatcher's questions without crying, without breaking, without any of the emotional collapse that people expect from innocent people, because they've seen too many movies about innocent people. That composure convicted her as much as anything else. The autopsy was inconclusive on manner of death. Cause was listed as cardiac arrest. But the medical examiner noted petechial indicators consistent with compression asphyxia, small hemorrhages in the eyes and surrounding tissue that can appear during suffocation. Consistent with is not the same as caused by. In court, that distinction got lost. The prosecution's theory was clean. Melissa discovered Daniel had resumed the affair. She waited until Caleb was away. She waited until Daniel went to the guest house, and she followed him there, and she smothered him, and she waited 41 minutes to make sure he was dead before she called 911. The smartwatch proved motive, the spikes that revealed the affair. The smartwatch proved opportunity. Daniel's own vitals recording his final minutes. The smartwatch proved struggle. The violent acceleration bursts before flatline. The defense argued the watch couldn't prove who was in that room with Daniel. It argued Carrie Solis had a key and a motive and a phone that had pinged a nearby cell tower that very night. It argued the search history was medical curiosity, not planning. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. They came back guilty. Carrie Solis testified for the prosecution. She was cooperative and composed. She acknowledged the affair. She acknowledged the key. She said she had been on a late-night run on March 7th. She did this often, insomnia, she said, and that she had not entered the property that night. She moved away 2 weeks after the conviction. New Mexico. She sold the house fast, loaded a rental truck, and left the state before the dust had settled over the verdict. Nobody on Ridgemont Drive knew exactly where she went. The defense had requested her wearable fitness data. The court declined to compel it. Patricia Ochoa, Melissa's defense attorney, raised one question during trial that would later seem prophetic. She was cross-examining the prosecution's digital forensics expert, a credentialed, confident man who had testified in dozens of cases involving wearable device evidence. She asked him, almost as an aside, "Can you say with certainty that the watch was on Daniel Harper's wrist when those readings were recorded?" The expert said yes. The wrist detection sensor confirmed contact. The data was valid. Ochoa didn't push. She didn't have the specific reason to push yet. She'd raised the question because it seemed like a reasonable thread to pull, not because she knew what was at the other end of it. She would spend a long time wishing she'd pulled harder. Raymond Chu is not a lawyer. He's not a forensic professional. He's a former software engineer in Austin who runs a podcast called Buried in the Data from a Spare Bedroom with Better Acoustic Foam Than Most Professional Studios. He got obsessed with wearable evidence after a wrongful conviction case he covered in 2019, and he is meticulous in the specific, exhausting way of someone who understands that being wrong on the internet is forever. He reached out to Melissa's appellate team 14 months after the conviction. They gave him everything. Not because they were certain he'd find something, but because they were running out of threads and he was offering to pull. He spent 6 weeks on the raw device logs, not the graphs, not the visualizations the jury saw. The raw logs, 47 pages of technical output that the prosecution had disclosed in discovery, that both legal teams had reviewed and found unremarkable, that had been sitting in a case file gathering digital dust. He almost missed it. Page 31. A status field that most people would skip because it looked like system maintenance data, the kind of background noise that firmware generates constantly, and that means nothing unless you know exactly what you're looking at. At 2:15:34 a.m., the watch had switched from wrist detection active mode to passive tracking mode. Raymond knew the firmware. He'd spent weeks learning it. Passive tracking mode was a battery conservation state with one specific trigger condition. The wrist detection sensor had registered that the watch was no longer on a human wrist. The watch was off Daniel Harper's wrist at 2:15 a.m. Then, at 2:58 a.m., 24 seconds later, it returned to active tracking mode. And at 2:17, the heart rate spiked to 151. And at 2:19, the line went flat. He sat back in his chair and read it again. Then again. Then he called 2 firmware engineers he knew from his previous career and asked them to independently review the same field without telling them what he'd found. Both of them came back with the same interpretation. The watch had been removed from Daniel Harper's wrist 2 minutes before the violent spikes began, which meant the violent spikes might not have been Daniel's heart rate at all. They might have been someone else's, or they might have been no one's. A device being moved, carried, shaken by a person whose own heart rate was surging from exertion or adrenaline or both, while the man whose wrist it was supposed to be recording lay somewhere else in that guest house, already gone. Raymond published 2 episodes. He was careful in the way that people are careful when they understand that carelessness in this direction destroys lives. He was not claiming Melissa was innocent. He was not claiming to know what happened in the guest house. He was claiming, specifically and documentably, that the prosecution's central assertion that Daniel Harper's final minutes were recorded on Daniel Harper's wrist was not supported by the raw device logs. The episodes were shared 340,000 times in the first 2 weeks. Patricia Ochoa filed an emergency appellate motion 7 days after the second episode dropped. 3 independent forensics experts reviewed the logs. All 3 confirmed the mode transition flag. All 3 confirmed its meaning. The case was reopened for review. Here's what nobody has been able to explain, even now. At 2:14 a.m., 3 minutes before the watch went offline, 4 minutes before the spikes began, the guest house light came on. The smart home system logged it. The prosecution used this to establish that Daniel was already in the guest house before the struggle. The defense never challenged the interpretation. But 2:14 is also when Carrie Solis's phone, according to cell tower records Raymond obtained through a public records request, that somehow neither legal team had pulled, pinged a tower that covered Ridgemont Drive and the 4 streets surrounding it. The prosecution knew about the cell ping. They'd characterized it as a general neighborhood ping consistent with a late-night run. They'd never emphasized it. The defense hadn't emphasized it either. Nobody asked, what if she didn't just ping the tower because she was running nearby? What if she was inside? She had a key. There were no signs of forced entry. The back gate, the one Daniel had given her access to, showed no damage. And Carrie Solis's own fitness tracker, the device whose data the court refused to compel, would have recorded her heart rate that night, her movement, her location, in the specific granular way that GPS-enabled wearables record location. That data exists somewhere, on a server, in a backup. In the account she presumably closed when she sold her house and moved to New Mexico, and changed her last name and stopped wearing a fitness tracker altogether. People stop wearing fitness trackers for all kinds of reasons, or for one very specific reason. Melissa Harper is 41 years old. She has been at Perryville for 3 years. Her son Caleb is 9 now. He lives with her parents in Tucson and sees her once a month across a visitation table. She still doesn't perform emotion for audiences. That quality, The flat, controlled affect that her family has always described as simply how Melissa is, cost her the jury. It will probably cost her in the court of public opinion too, where the people who believe she did it point to that composure as proof, as though grief is only grief when it looks the way movies say it should look. Her appellate team is working the mode transition angle hard. They have the 3 independent experts. They have Raymond's documentation. They have a growing body of forensic literature on the unreliability of wearable device data when raw logs aren't fully examined. They have a judge who, in a recent preliminary hearing, asked the prosecution's representatives a question that reportedly made them very uncomfortable. Did your digital forensics expert review page 31 of the raw device logs before testifying? The answer, apparently, was no. Whether that's enough is a different question. We live surrounded by data now. Our watches know our heart rates and sleep stages and stress responses. Our phones know every place we've been and how long we stayed. Our cars, our doorbells, our thermostats, all of it logging, all of it time-stamped, all of it waiting to be subpoenaed and displayed on a large screen and explained to 12 people who have been told that numbers don't lie. Numbers don't lie. But numbers don't tell the whole story either. Data is a record, and a record is only as good as the interpretation applied to it, and interpretation is done by human beings with limited technical knowledge, with narrative needs, with the very human tendency to stop looking once the story makes sense. The prosecution stopped looking on page 12 of a 47-page log. Nobody noticed for 9 months. And a woman is in prison. Maybe she should be. Maybe Melissa Harper killed her husband in a detached guest house in Scottsdale, Arizona, and the mode transition flag has some innocent explanation that nobody has thought of yet. And justice is slow but correct. That's possible. But it's also possible that someone else was in that room. Someone with a key and a motive and a fitness tracker she no longer wears. Someone who understood, maybe, that a smartwatch generates data, but not necessarily truth. Someone who understood that if you hold a dead man's watch and move it at the right moment, you can make the data say almost anything you want it to say. The data didn't lie. But someone in that guest house might have understood it better than the investigators did, and that person moved to New Mexico. And March 7th comes every year. And at 2:17 a.m., the same question circulates through the same forums, passed between strangers who have read the same logs and watched the same graphs and come to the same impasse. Did the smartwatch record a murder? Or did it help the real killer walk away? Melissa Harper is still waiting for someone to find out.
So, that's the end of this story, but there are plenty of other great ones right here. Before you go, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring that little bell.